What's up, guys? It's TJ at 626 Productions here. Finally back again with another podcast. It only took 6 months. Every single sport is now out of season. We talked about before, but it's now college football season. And this week, finally joined by a guest. This week's going to be Pat with us. Pat, what's up, man?
What's up, TJ? Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to get into it, talk a little college football, do a little preview of how we think things are going to shake out, and hopefully we're at least close to being right.
Yeah, I mean, the playoff committee has shown like no one really knows what they're going to do. So we could say some of the most random stuff this week, and that is what they actually do. So who knows? Like we could be the ones that have a better idea of what they're going to do versus what they think they're going to do. So let's just jump right into it. Last week, it's still a lot of chaos. Not as much as the week before, but like a lot of things still happened. Like Miami up 21 points, just completely blew that game.
I mean, their defense has put them in so many bad positions all year. You saw it come back to bite them against Georgia Tech, and then Cuse, Kyle McCord put on a show, they did exactly what they needed to do, and Cam Ward just didn't have enough to bail the Canes out.
I mean, and that's really been the story of Miami this year. It's like it's been Cam Ward and only Cam Ward. He kind of did it last year with Washington State too, and then goes to Miami, turns that program from an 8-4 team into a playoff contender. But like you say, like the missing pieces on that defense have just really bitten them. Syracuse isn't bad. Let's give them some credit. But should Miami have lost that game? Absolutely not.
And I mean, you got to think if you're a Syracuse fan, you're probably thinking back to what was that, mid September when they lost to Stanford. And you're just thinking, if that doesn't happen, they have a shot, or they would have had a shot at actually making the ACC championship. So, kind of a crazy turn of events for the Orange.
Yeah, and I mean, how no one has kind of like respected them up until this week, I have no idea. Like, I mean, a game like that, like, definitely hurts. But I mean, we've seen random games like that all across the country, all like year round. Like, no one's safe on any given week. I mean, Georgia, who, you'll see them go down to Texas and they just completely wipe the floor with Texas. Next thing you know, they're in a 9 overtime game with Georgia Tech at the end of the year. Like, it's just complete complete chaos all year, which is great for college football.
Oh, yeah. I mean, as a fan, you got to love it. I don't think we're quite at shades of 2007 yet, but it's been a great year. It's been a chaotic year, and with the 12-team playoff kicking off, I think we've got a good shot at seeing some excitement in the postseason, and maybe not just the same old Alabama's, Ohio State's making noise and winning natties, but maybe we're looking at who knows, maybe Indiana sneaks in there and makes some noise, or maybe SMU takes care of business against Clemson and makes a little bit of noise. Should be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, this season, like you say, is like not fully 2007 yet, but in a week from now, depending on how they decide to go about the final poll, it could get past 2007 without any extra games being played, like just by them setting it up. So
I don't know. I think we're in, I guess, position is the best word to say, for an interesting decision by the committee next Sunday afternoon. I don't think it's an easy decision. You've got, I guess, if you want to loop Indiana in there and say they're not guaranteed in, you got four teams fighting for maybe two spots. So it could get a little dicey, and I'm sure at least one fan base is going to be a little upset on how it shakes out.
yeah, I mean, which you kind of had to expect. Like we needed to expand the playoffs. 4 team was just not enough. Like having the Florida State situation last year, thankfully, was the straw that broke the camel's back. But now you still have like a whole nother issue of like, yes, those teams that should have been in the 4 team playoff, they're all going to be in. But now there's a 12 team playoff, and now instead of it being, 1 or 2 teams just missing out at 5 or 6, now you're going to have, kind of a March Madness situation of like, okay, you have like one of these fringe, like 11th ranked team in the country, 12th ranked team in the country. And if you have some upsets in the conference championship week, next thing you know, they're getting bumped out. And yeah, they're top 12. They deserve to be in there, but they're not a conference champion.
And I
So it'll
mean,
really interesting to see that.
I think that's going to be, like you said, a really interesting thing to take a look at and keep an eye on. Because personally, I think Arizona State might be in a little bit of trouble this weekend. People are sleeping on Iowa State. That's a good team with a really good defense, and if they win that game, then that's one more at-large spot that's taken away, right? I think the AP poll had ASU at number 12, so they would be in the playoff. And not taking away a spot if they win the Big 12. But if ISU gets in, I think they were hovering around the 16, 17 spot. That's taking away an at large bid. God forbid if Clemson wins, right, down there at 18, um, that's taking away another at large spot. And if UNLV somehow takes care of business too, then it's complete chaos. And the committee has really, really tough decisions to make.
Yeah, and the committee, like, we're kind of guessing that unless you get just blown out in your conference championship game, like, it's not really going to be a negative towards you. So when we talk about that UNLV Boise State game, UNLV is sitting, I think, in most polls around the 21 spot or so.
Yeah, I
And
think
what's Boise, like 7, 8, somewhere in there?
Boise's hovering in the 7-8 spot. I think they were actually back around 9 in this week's AP poll. Let me pull it up so I'm not spewing fake information here. But
So, I mean, if UNLV wins that game, and let's say it's a 3-point game, you have Boise State who loses a conference championship game against a team that they beat earlier in the year on the road, and their only other loss is a potential undefeated Oregon team, Big Ten champion. Do you drop Boise State out of the rankings? Do you put them at number 11? Do you bring UNLV up? If SMU loses to Clemson, where do they fall to? Where does Clemson rise to? Because then you're looking at, I guess at that point, ACC champion would be ahead. Uh, Clemson could be a 3 seed by the time it's all said and done,
yeah,
depending on who wins the Big 12 and who wins the Mountain West. And I mean, the American Conference is basically all but taken itself out now that Army's lost to Notre Dame.
thanks, Memphis.
Memphis upset Tulane. So, I mean, just American Conference just ate itself right at the end of the season.
It did, and I was high on Tulane going into that Memphis game. I thought they were going to go down to Memphis, take care of business on Thanksgiving night, and their defense looked rough in that second half. John Summerall's still a great coach. We might get to him later if we're talking about coaching vacancies that opened up, but that was a tough pill to swallow for Tulane because, I mean, they were 17, I think, in the latest CFP poll. So they were right there where if the ACC champ slipped up or if Boise slipped up, they could have slid into that number 4 seed and gotten a first round bye, which would have been huge for them, huge for the American, huge for all non P4 teams. But I mean, let's give Memphis credit. This is their second straight 10 plus win season in a row. That's a good program down there. And it's no slouch playing in the American anymore. It's not like a UCF 2017 situation where we're seeing the American champ get disrespected. I think they're getting their flowers a little bit now.
Yeah, I mean, the American Conference has really been an interesting conference, like really since its inception, because I mean, it was the reincarnation of the Big East, and then having like some random the Conference USA like power, some of the like random MAC teams like joining in like in that era. And I mean, when it opened, like started up, you had like a really good Louisville team. I believe that was Teddy Bridgewater, Louisville, Blake
Yeah.
Bortles, UCF. Started off really good, kind of took a little bit of a nosedive, ACC poaching some of the teams. And then, like you say, next thing you know, it is like very good UCF teams, very good Cincinnati teams. And now that those two teams are gone, a very good Tulane team who beat Southern Cal last year. Or was it last year or 2 years ago?
I
Either
think it
way,
was 2 years ago.
Tulane's been very good for the past couple seasons now. Memphis now finally seeing a rise up once again. So I mean, it's a very good conference. It's a bit weird now. You have teams like Charlotte in there. But the top of that conference, they can play with most teams in some of the Power Four, maybe outside Big Ten and SEC.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, even if you want to look at Tulane and their resume this year prior to the Memphis game, their two losses going into that game were both pretty well respected preseason P5 teams. Oklahoma definitely didn't meet their preseason expectations. They took a step back a little bit this year under Venables, but K State was a solid team. They played pretty hard this past Saturday in Farmageddon, but couple of Avery Johnson mistakes kind of doomed them there. But that's not a bad team at all. You know, that's a good Big 12 team. And Tulane proved they could hang with a good Big 12 team and sort of a middle of the road SEC team, closing that gap and hopefully changing some perceptions about non P4 teams.
Yeah, and you talking about that Oklahoma team, like early in the year, completely different. And I feel like you saw that a lot across college football where there were a lot of teams that either were expected to be good or at least be better than what they ended up being at the end of the season. I mean, teams like Ole Miss, Alabama as well start off the season great. And like if you want to look at under like a quick microscope of Alabama, their season is probably best summed up by that Georgia game where they went up 28 nothing just quick. And it's like, Kalen DeBoer, Nick Saban, that's going to be the easiest transition in history. Next thing you know, end of the third quarter, Georgia has a 3-point lead. Or I guess maybe it was more like fourth, but still Georgia came all the way back, and that's exactly how Alabama started the season. Really hot. Next thing you know, they really pulled the brakes. A loss to Vanderbilt toward the end of the season, even more. A bad loss to Oklahoma, who at that point had already fallen off the tracks. And I mean, just talking SEC right there, but I mean, we saw that across college football as a whole.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, even look at it's weird to call them a Big Ten team, but look at USC in the Big Ten. They start off with that big win over LSU on a neutral site, week one. People start singing their praises a little bit. They played well after that game. Close loss up at Michigan, close loss to Penn State. But the wheels definitely came off the bus for Lincoln a little bit this year. Miller Moss got benched halfway through the season. Jaden Maiava took over, who is a G5 transfer himself. Or sorry, yeah, G5. We'll call it that. And USC just completely looked different than the team I think a lot of people thought they would be at the beginning of the year, especially after that LSU win.
Yeah, I mean, Southern Cal kind of did what I think most people kind of thought, maybe like Oklahoma and Texas would do in the SEC. Oklahoma did it more so. And then Texas just actually showed up this year. They, had some close games. Vanderbilt was playing everyone very closely. They played
Mm-hmm.
Texas as well closely. I mean, I believe their lone loss is to Georgia,
Yep.
if I'm not mistaken, right? Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah.
I
And that
mean,
was a
it's
pretty
not like they have
competitive game.
yeah, it's not like they have a bad loss. We're going to get a rematch of that game here in 1 week. Um, we could easily see a different outcome, but we'll get to that later on. Um, but yeah, I mean the Big Ten schools is such an interesting dynamic because you know you have Washington who just made the national title game last year, lost every single road game they played, and pretty poorly as well. Then Oregon, who comes in, who was riding the coattails of the Pac-12, just barely missing out on stuff the past couple seasons. Next thing you know, they're in the best position of everyone. Defending national champion Michigan goes down. Indiana comes out of nowhere, but is not really battle tested. Ohio State, they've won their games, but 1 week they're a great team. The next week, you don't know what's on the field. And you can say the same thing in Penn State as well.
Yeah, definitely. And Penn State, they had that nervy outcome up in Minnesota. PJ Flex got a decent team this year with this Gophers squad, but I mean, if you're the number 3 or 4 ranked team in the AP poll this week, you should be able to take care of Minnesota a little bit easier than that. Drew Aller definitely looks better than he did last year. Um, Part of that is probably the new scheme they've got with Kotelnicki, but at the same time, like you said, there's been moments where Penn State is not super convincing, right? And you're looking at this team and you're like, is this a typical James Franklin team where they're going to beat the Purdue's, the Indianas, the Minnesotas. But when they come up against an Ohio State, we'll see it this weekend when they come up against Oregon in the Big Ten Championship. Can they rise to that level of competition? That's the big
Yeah.
question for Penn State, I think.
And a question I'm just going to put out there right now, but we'll come back to later, is if Oregon, boat races Penn State, that would be Penn State's second loss, and they're in a conference
Mm-hmm.
championship game. Does that then raise the competition or the conversation rather of some of these, higher end SEC schools who have gotten eaten alive by that schedule with 3 losses? How are those going to compare? We can touch on that later, but just to put that question out there
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now.
that's a good question.
But I do want to go into our rankings. I've been following rankings for a couple weeks now. Pat, I believe this was your first ranking this past weekend.
Yeah, yeah, fired them up for the first time. Took your rankings as a little bit of basis. I waited for the AP poll to drop too, just so I could kind of use both of those as a, we'll say, base point when making my evaluations. I know I have a little bit different from you, and definitely a little bit different from the AP poll, but we have a lot of the same teams in there. I don't think I put anybody in there that you don't have on there, or the AP doesn't have on there. Wanted to put Duke in there, but they're just, I don't know, they're a weird team this year. Shout out to
They
Manny Diaz coming in, winning 9 games right away, but
very, very weird team. I mean, and you know, this is a Duke team that in all cases should have beaten SMU. SMU got the ball back with
yeah.
3 minutes left in that game to go down and score to win it. And they fumbled the football, and Duke just had to run it out. They get I think it was like a 35-yarder right down the middle. All they
Mm-hmm.
have to do is hit that through. They win the game, and SMU blocks the kick and wins in overtime. I mean, it was crazy ending to that game. SMU was leading that whole game. Duke comes back. SMU, easy chance to go down and win, just completely botches it, and Duke decided they wanted to botch it harder. So, if that game went differently, it could be a whole different conversation for the ACC right now. We could be looking at a Duke Clemson final. Depending on how other outcomes may have gone, you could have a
Yep.
Duke Miami, and it would have been competitive. This wouldn't have been I believe it was 2014. Duke getting fed to Florida State just because that was the only other team left in the
Mm-hmm.
ACC.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been probably 10 to 1 point score or 1 score game. So just crazy year all the way around.
Oh yeah,
But
totally.
going into the top 25, I'll give a basis of how I do it. I wait until October, the first week of October, to actually do it. So that way we see teams. I try not to get too bogged down into the AP rankings just because a lot of those rankings, they get their weight from preseason rankings, which,
Mm-hmm.
you know, Florida State was what, number 5?
Think they started 5 or 6, and I mean they were in the top 10 for 3 weeks, because they played that week 0 game over in Ireland, lost, dropped to 10. Then they were on bye. Then they played BC, um, and that's what kind of showed us maybe this isn't the same FSU team without Jordan Travis.
Yeah. And I mean, while I still think an undefeated Florida State team could have and should have, under most circumstances, been in the playoff, the committee may have gotten that right, not putting them in with Travis. Just because they have to go out and get DJ from Oregon State, that did not work out at
No.
all. It was very, very prevalent immediately. I mean that the Florida State team was very good last year. They lost a lot of starters, but Jordan Travis really led the way for them.
Yeah, he carried a lot of weight, and they lost a lot of defensive starters as well. That was a really good defense last year. Jared Verse was a first-round pick as an edge rusher. He was one of the top edges in all of college football last year. Losing him clearly hurt, and unfortunately, maybe I should say, I've watched a decent amount of FSU this year, and their linebackers are just consistently out of position. But like you said, it just proves that those preseason rankings don't mean a whole lot.
Yeah, and to put a final pin in the Florida State conversation, the defense struggled, the offense has issues, probably just not having that main quarterback at the helm. They go out and get Gus Malzahn from UCF, but what will they do to address that defense next year? Because as we see, next year, Miami's going to be losing a lot of pieces. SMU, are they going to be able to repeat this? Clemson, we don't really know what they're going to be. They're going to be near the top, but what exactly that is, we don't know. Uh, and then, who knows if Manny Diaz is going to keep Duke in line, if Pittsburgh can finish out the season. So Florida State could really turn around pretty quickly. It's just a matter of if they're going to address all their questions now.
Yeah, and do they have the NIL capital to be able to do that, right? It's one thing to get these guys out of high school, and FSU's done a decent job on the recruiting trail this year. I know they lost a few higher profile recruits on the offensive side of the ball, but overall they still have a decent class. But do they have the NIL backing after a really, really tough year where, I mean, outside of Purdue, they're probably the worst team in the P4. Are people going to spend money this offseason, you know?
And this might be the last unsanctioned off season for NIL, because I believe the hearing will come up in April of if there will be a salary cap, and that
Yeah.
will almost certainly be passed. So then all the big schools are going to have to cap out at 22 million. Is everyone going to go hard at this one and just, put everything out there just to try and get ahead? Or, are they going to have to settle in before that salary cap comes into place? I'm not 100% sure, but I would certainly imagine you're going to see a lot of money being thrown around in February.
Definitely, definitely.
So we keep bouncing around it. Now we're actually going to do the top 25. And once again, I start my rankings in October. I try not to pay too much attention. So by doing that, I typically give a little bit more love to some of the group of 5, group of 6, whatever we're calling the other conferences these days. Schools, along with a lot of the power schools, are probably a little bit lower than you would normally see them. Some of that being just matchups, eye tests from me, what have you. So going 25-1, starting out, I'm going to do Army, Missouri, UNLV, Iowa State, and Tulane. Tulane dropped quite considerably for how I do my rankings. I try to keep people, even if they win or lose, about within a 3 spot gap of where they would be. They dropped 6 last
Mm,
week for me. That Memphis loss,
that was tough,
while
man.
while I still had Memphis as a fringe top 25 team, um, I believe I had them at 24 last week. And I don't know if I would have even dropped them out had they lost to Tulane. I probably would have kept them right there at 25. It was just I fully expected Tulane to win that game. They would have had a nice little win, but 15 moving up to 14 max. That was kind of what I was expecting.
Yeah.
Huge upset. Now Memphis in my rankings at 20. Now this is where it gets completely different from the playoff rankings, from the AP, from most any other rankings you'll see. Uh, that will be putting BYU at 19,
Ooh,
Miami at 18.
wow.
I don't like Miami at all. They've had a good year, but when it comes down to it, having those big games, can Miami beat most teams in the country? Yes, which I rank them at 18th, which means they're better than over 100 teams.
Right.
But those playoff caliber teams, do I think that they can beat them week in, week out? No, they can't do it, and they've shown they can't do it. That being said, it's an ACC run. Syracuse, after the big win, the comeback, they're going to be right ahead of Miami. Clemson in there at 16. We'll see what they do against SMU. We have the death penalty bowl this weekend. Will they be able to win to hop into the they're going to have to get that berth. They're out of the at-large, both in my ranking and in the media's. So we'll see how they move. Colorado, who I dropped back a
Ooh,
lot last week, got a lot of spots back. I believe I moved them up 4. So they seesawed
Wow.
right back up to the front
Wow.
of that kind of fringe pack. Uh, then, bit controversial here, as you've seen from the last 5 spots. Alabama,
Mm.
Alabama at 14. Once again, similar to Miami, I think they're a very good team. Uh, but they've got bad losses with Oklahoma, Vandy. Their consistency just isn't there. Like, I think that they can beat some of those playoff teams, but they're not consistent. You don't know what
Hmm.
Alabama team is going to show up.
And what Jalen Milroe is going to show up.
That I mean, that's been the biggest thing. I've been talking about this for probably 2 weeks now. Like, he has just disappeared this year. He was incredibly impressive last year. I feel like most people figured he would be a Heisman finalist,
Hmm.
and he's nowhere near that conversation this year.
Some crazy decision making on his part, especially on that pick six against OU 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a head scratcher from quarterback. I don't know if he's just had a hard time learning under DeBoer, but also it's not really been anything too groundbreaking that DeBoer has introduced outside of Saban. A little bit more pace and tempo in that offense, but a lot of the same play calling that I've noticed. So not really sure what happened there, but I mean it's affected him 100%. Next at 13, Arizona State. They have
Mm.
soared in my rankings, and this is probably about where they're going to come in to most other rankings as well this week. They've looked good past couple weeks. They've won the games that they've needed to win. Uh, there's not a whole lot else they can say. They control their destiny. They beat Iowa State. They're in, and you know, decent chance they get a bye.
Yeah.
Decent chance they get a bye. So I think my rankings, I believe that does not allow them to, but still in the playoff, comfortable spot. Number 12, South Carolina, hottest teams in the country. You know, they've won 6 straight, but the conversation is of the 3 SEC teams, they lost the 2 head-to-heads.
Hmm. Hmm.
How much does that matter versus, how you're playing now? Because South Carolina lost head-to-head. Their biggest loss and number one true loss of the season was to Ole Miss. They go to Alabama, lose on the road by 2. So you have a 21-point loss to Ole Miss, a 2-point loss to Alabama. On the flip side, South Carolina's won 6 straight games in that span. Alabama's lost 2. Ole Miss has a loss to Kentucky. So we don't really know how the committee is going to go about that, how they're going to value, what are you doing for me right now versus what did you do against the teams that are with you? We don't know. And truly, they might change that year to year
Yeah.
depending on the case. To me, I think I'm somewhere in the middle, and you'll see that because I have Ole Miss at number 11.
Oh, wow.
So, so if South Carolina, if this holds true, then there's not a whole lot of upsets this weekend. Arizona State would bounce South Carolina out of the playoffs, so they would be the first team out. But in the hypothetical, they are a top 12 team in the country because, whether in the playoff or they're not in the playoff, unless you're an Oregon fan and you're playing them at home, I don't know many teams in the country that want to play South Carolina.
No, they're hot. And I mean, Lenore Sellers has been one of the best players in college football the past, we'll say, 4 or 5 weeks. What he did against Clemson this weekend and against that defense, that was impressive stuff. Whether you're a South Carolina fan, whether you're a Clemson fan, right? I think anyone who watched that game walked away extremely impressed with Sellers and Shane Beamer's team.
Well, and I mean, now with how good South Carolina has been, it's really as Lenore's goes, South Carolina goes as well because South Carolina was down in that game, and part of that was he had was it one fumble, one interception. So I mean,
Yeah.
had some turnovers that hurt South Carolina a little bit. And then on the flip side, he willed them into scoring on that final drive. So, you know, when he's doing good, things are good in Columbia. When he's struggling a little bit, you know, it's a little bit different. They're having to lean on that defense, which has been a great,
Lights out.
great defense this season. So Ole Miss 11, then Tennessee at number 10.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they got lucky this weekend. I think they were on the road to lose to Vanderbilt, and that crazy interception
Yeah.
turned that whole game. And just one of those things that the ball bounced their way. So Tennessee at number 10. I think they're a playoff team. However, of those two lost teams, I am the least impressed by them. Uh, Going in further to the top 10, Indiana at 9, Ohio State. I hated that team. That whatever showed up against Michigan, that was bad.
Yeah.
I mean, truly, if that team showed up against Penn State, that Ohio State team is not in the playoff this year.
No.
Uh,
And I mean, Will Howard talked a big game this week. I don't know if you heard any of the interviews he was doing leading up to the Michigan game, but he was talking himself up. He was talking Ohio State up. He was talking the rivalry up. And this is a guy who's never even played in the game before, and then he goes out and he has a major stinker. I won't say it's all on Will Howard, but oof, that was rough.
yeah, I mean, that was the first half was what it was. That second half, I think 25 of the 30 minutes were spent in either team's red zone,
Mm-hmm.
and there was only one field goal. I mean, how? I mean, Michigan was 6-5 going into that game. I don't think a lot of people had a lot of expectation for them.
No.
Ohio State's the number 2 team in the country. You would kind of expect, with how Michigan has ran that rivalry the past couple years, um, getting the national championship last year, you would want to take it to them.
Oh yeah.
And you put up that kind of performance at home when you're the number 2 team in the country, it, that's bad. They'll be in the playoffs just because they were the number 2 team in the country last week. But depending on their matchup, they it could be a quick road out for the
Mm-hmm.
Buckeyes. Um, so they're at the number 8 right now. We'll see who kind of jockeys with them. But I mean, they could lose home field advantage on that game, so we'll have to see. Going from Ohio State, I then have Georgia at 7,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably about where they might end up. They might move up to 6. Uh, Most controversial for where I've had them for how long? Boise State, back at number 6. I put them at number 6 very early on, and they were slowly kind of backing down almost every week. There was, one week was 7, next week was 8, next week was 9, in that little area. Just because the Mountain West doesn't have a lot. The only team that they've really played has been UNLV with a great Barry Odom defense. But, then they have games where they're playing Hawaii and it's a little bit too close for how deep in the game it was. Um, but you also can't deny they have one loss, and that is on the road at number 1 Oregon, and it
Yeah.
was a walk-off field goal that beat them. So when they have played good teams, they've looked good. Of course, you want to win those games, but given that that's their only loss and they're almost destined to be a conference champion, can't deny it. Number 6, I've been there about all season. They're still there. Then SMU at 5, undefeated in ACC play. ACC's not the best conference this year, but to go undefeated in conference play, their sole loss is to BYU early in the year by 3. Not a bad loss, versus some of the other losses that you see in this kind of area.
Yeah.
Not bad. So SMU at 5, Notre Dame at 4. Talk about a bad loss. Northern Illinois, huge head scratcher. But unlike some of the other teams with bad losses, they have fully redeemed themselves. I mean, they go out, play good teams. You have an Army team who's getting talked about as a playoff contender. and then they weren't overnight. 35-point win, and outside of like 2 minutes in the second quarter, Army was not in that game at all. Notre Dame has looked great ever since that really weird loss to Northern Illinois. Then Penn State at 3, kind of didn't have a whole lot of other places to put them. So Penn State at 3, Texas at 2, and then one of the easiest ones, Oregon at 1.
Yeah.
Even before the Georgia upset, I actually switched those two. Put Oregon at number 1. I think that they're a pretty solid team this year. Dylan Gabriel, in his 13th season in college football, has finally figured out how to be consistent. I think this is his year. I think this is the Ducks' year. I think unless something crazy happens, which now that we have such a big playoff now, it's possible, very possible. But I think the Ducks are going to take it this year. I think they're the best team in college football. So that is my top 25. Pat, I'm going to throw it over to you. Let's see what you got.
Yeah, I think, like I said, we're pretty similar. We have a few differences. Like, I actually didn't realize I must have been going too quick. I don't have Tulane in my top 25 anymore. And
Oh,
I'm a
wow.
lot higher on Iowa State than you are. But besides that, I think we're pretty similar. At 25, I've got Memphis. 24, I've got Syracuse. Little low probably after that game this weekend against Miami, but I don't know. I don't know which orange team is real, right? The team that's going wire to wire with Miami, or the team that's going wire to wire with Stanford. So that's why I've got them at 24. 23, those in the SEC probably aren't going to like me much for this, but I've got the Missouri Tigers. They've got 3 losses against pretty much the 3 good teams they played this year. 9-3 is nothing to scoff at. Eli did a nice job this year despite injuries, but I just don't think Missouri's great. Um, 22, I've got Army. Like you said, 10-1 right now, or yeah, 10-1 because I haven't played Navy yet. Only loss is to a really, really good Notre Dame team. Did they get manhandled? Yes, but this Notre Dame defensive front is one of, full stop, the best defensive fronts in the country. And this isn't sort of Brian Kelly Notre Dame where they're going to go up against a Clemson or an Alabama and just completely fold. I think this team's built a little bit differently. At 21, I've got Illinois, the Fighting Brett Bielmas. A nice story there. Rutgers and Greg Schiano kind of saved their season with that crazy timeout. But
That was a
Illinois,
crazy ending.
wild stuff. But I mean, the Illini are 9-3. In a tough Big Ten, um, they've beaten most of their competition this year. Yes, they lost to Penn State. No, they didn't look great against Penn State, but they are kind of like you did, ranking. Shoot, who was it? Somebody at 18 on your spot. I forget who you've had there. They're better than almost 100 teams in college football, right? They're a very
Yeah,
good team. I just don't think they're top of the line. That's why I
yeah,
got them at
which
21. For
yeah, that
me,
was
oh, sorry.
Miami over at
Yep,
18.
that's right. That's right.
But yeah, it's like you say, like they're in that like weird zone of like, are they a playoff contender? Not really, but are they a very good team? Yes. And you saying Illinois, I was very close to putting them in that 25 spot, but I felt like, you know, had let's say that Rutgers timeout didn't happen, we're looking at a whole different
Oh
situation.
yeah.
So
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
Army has a bad loss with Notre Dame, but it's one loss versus a potential 8-4 Illinois team.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so that was kind of my reasoning there. But
Yeah.
go on.
20, I've got UNLV. I think this is a really good UNLV team. Ever since they put Haj Malik Williams in at quarterback over Matt Sluka, I think they've looked a lot better and a lot more diverse offensively. I think it's going to be a heck of a game up on the blue turf on Friday night against Boise State. And I don't know. If I'm Boise State, I'm a little worried about what UNLV can do, right? They can spread you out, they can move fast. And one thing that is, if Boise State has any weakness this year, it's their passing game, right? Their passing game's not bad, but it's been a little less than you would want it to be against teams like Hawaii or even this past weekend against Wyoming, who's by no stretch a very good team this year.
No, it's I would honestly, having watched a few of the Boise State games, like just like full attention, I would say that that pass game is serviceable at best. It is when Genty is going against 9 guys in the box and they're shutting him down and they rely on that arm. It's not there most of the time. Every
No.
now and then, if you get a receiver running open just because you got 9 guys in the box going for Genty, uh, but also he's missed a lot. I'm blanking on his name right now. He's missed a lot of those throws this year. So when you would want him to at least step up in some of those, like 1 out of every 10 plays, it's not always there. So, like you said, it is very vulnerable. It's not a given for Boise State this weekend.
Yeah. I believe his name's Maddox Madsen. I
Yeah,
want to
it's something.
say.
It was like double M, something like
Yeah.
that. But
But yeah, I'm with you. Don't have a ton of confidence in their passing ability, but I still, like you, have Boise ranked pretty high. Moving on, we'll do 19 through 15. Got a little bit of differences here than you did. 19, I've got Colorado. This is a good Colorado
oh,
team. Shout out to Dion. I did not believe before the season. I'll admit it. But I think he shut me and a lot of people who are way more important than me up with the way that Colorado's performed. Shador has been amazing this year. He's definitely going to be a top pick in the draft. Travis Hunter is Travis Hunter. Um, and they've been able to do this without a really strong offensive line, which might be honestly the most impressive part.
mm-hmm.
At
Yeah.
18, I've got Clemson. So, dropped them probably about, I'd say like 6 spots. I know I didn't do an official ranking the week before, but I probably would have had them right around that 13 to 12 range. Um, Clemson's kind of what you come to expect from Clemson post Trevor Lawrence. They're a good team that is going to hang around and be in that conversation, but just doesn't have enough to get over that hump, I don't think. Um, at 17, I've got BYU. Great story this year. Having pretty much no expectations with the Big 12 this year and putting up a 10-win season is impressive. Yes, the wheels kind of came off the bus a little bit at the end there, but tip your cap to BYU. It's a really nice story. And I mean, they're a good football team, and they deserve to be in a good bowl. At 16, I've got the Miami Hurricanes, kind of the same logic you have. I don't think they're playoff worthy with 2 losses, mainly because, let me see, I wrote it down. Yeah, they have the number 55 strength of schedule this year. Not great. Um, they have no top 25 wins this year, right? And Mario Cristobal, great recruiter, great guy to build a program, but he just makes the stupidest in-game decisions. And I think because of that, you really just can never trust Miami, regardless of how good Cam Ward is. 15, I've got Iowa State. Like I said, I'm a
Oh,
lot higher on the clones than you are.
very much, very much.
Yeah, they're a great defense. Rocco Becht, he's a good quarterback. He's nothing special, but that's a good defense Iowa State has. They played really, really well against K State this past weekend in Farmageddon, one of the more underrated rivalries out there. And I don't know, we might get to it if we make playoff predictions today, but I think they can make some noise and surprise some people in the Big 12 championship down in Texas this weekend. 14. Down at 14, you and I flipped these two teams. So you had Bama at 14 and Ole Miss at
Hmm.
11. I've got the Rebels at 14. Um,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yes, they've got that head-to-head win over South Carolina. Yes, they've got that great, super convincing win over Georgia, but they've also just had some really mystifying performances. You know, they lost to a really, really bad Kentucky team at home.
Yeah.
The LSU game, they had one. I know it's Tiger Stadium. I know it's at night, but I don't know. I would just like to see a little bit better closing there. Um, and then, of course, losing to this year's Florida team. They've turned it around. They're definitely a different team with DJ back there, but still it's a 7-5 Florida team. And if I don't know, you got playoff aspirations, I think you got to win that game.
Yeah, and
Um,
Florida's another one of those teams. Like we talked a lot about those teams that start the year really hot, and now they're just kind of like limping their way into a maybe playoff contention. Florida's one of those teams where like the start of their season was very rough. They didn't really know what they were doing. Once they got underway with Lagway, uh, you know, that was a completely different Florida team, and they
yeah,
started off the season very well. It's just they started so far behind the eight ball that they weren't able to do much other than salvage a pretty nice bowl game. They'll probably find their way into the Music City Bowl.
yeah. I wouldn't even be surprised if Florida finds their way to a Gator Bowl, maybe. If the Gator Bowl is trying to sell a bunch of tickets. But regardless, I've got the South Carolina Gamecocks at 13.
Mm.
We already talked about them. You know, we don't really need to go back into that. This is a good team. If you told me when I was standing in Williams-Brice Stadium at the first week of the season, watching South Carolina barely beat Old Dominion, that they'd be 13 at the end of the year, I think I'd call you crazy. So I think that's a huge testament to Shane Beamer and the job he's done building this team throughout the year.
Well,
Um,
it's like you said, the ultimate smokescreen.
can't show him anything, right? Um, at number 12 in my rankings, I've got the Sun Devils of Arizona State. Speaking of great coaching jobs, Kenny Dillingham has done an amazing job at Arizona State. I mean, this is a team that came in with literally zero expectations this year, and they just flat out competed no matter what. They almost lost the game at Texas State earlier in the year. I think that was a Thursday night game or a Friday night game. And since that point, they've just been growing and growing and growing. And really, I mean, if their quarterback doesn't get hurt in that Utah game and they don't have to play their backup against Cincinnati, uh, this could be an 11-1 team. And they were a few better kicks away from beating Cincinnati with their backup quarterback. So this is a
Hmm.
good team. I think we're in for a really good matchup in the Big 12 champ.
Yeah, yeah. I think they're doing the right stuff at the right time.
Definitely, definitely. It's very similar to South Carolina. They're peaking when they need to. Um, at 11, I've got the Tide. Um, really, that's just based on talent. I mean, this is an extremely talented team. What Alabama team is not? Do I fully believe in this team? God, no. But I feel like on talent alone, um, they deserve that higher ranking over Ole Miss. Yes, Ole Miss is a really talented team, but I think if they play each other, Alabama wins and wins probably by 7 to 10 points. And like you said, Alabama does have that head-to-head advantage over the Gamecocks. Was Lenore Sellers perfectly healthy? We don't really know, but a win's a win. And if the committee values head to head results, I think that's what puts them at that 11 spot.
Something I want to bring up about Alabama that I don't think a lot of people are discussing is a lot of people are worried that Alabama might get into the playoff on like brand alone, like whether they deserve it or not, 50-50. But it will be the brand that pushes them through, which, I mean, people watch Alabama. You want eyes, that's a great way to get
Oh, yeah.
eyes. I would think one thing that people aren't talking about, as hit or miss as Alabama has been throughout the season, they do have playoff experience. The
Yep.
team was there last year. They got that experience. They were 1 yard away from, extending that game against the eventual national
Mm
champions.
hmm. Hmm.
Their head coach this season played in the national championship game last year at Washington. So he's been there. He's got recent experience. So this is a team that, while we think like, should they be in? Should they not be in? They could get in, and then boom, just turn it on.
Yeah, yeah. I think they can make some noise if they get in. Never count out Alabama, you know. But they're just in a weird position right now, you know. If they don't lose that Oklahoma game, they're probably sitting 6, 7 range, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
comfortably in. But it's not a game of hypotheticals, unfortunately.
100%.
So at 10, this is a little bit different than your ranking. I know you had them at 6. I've got Boise State at 10. The reason being, really, because of, like I said, my lack of confidence in their pass game. Genti's a great player. I think he should win the Heisman. Um, but against, maybe not this weekend against UNLV, but against a good team that can stack 8 or 9 in the box, does Boise have enough to beat that? Right? It's one thing to do it against, I know they didn't play them this year, but let's just say Colorado State. Um, but it's another thing to do it against Tennessee or Georgia, or Ohio State, right? These really elite, high level defenses.
Yeah, and not just 1 week, but Georgia the first week, Tennessee the next week. Finishing up with like Oregon,
Right,
whose
right.
defense isn't necessarily the best, but you're going to have a fast, like high pace offense with Oregon. If they go down and score, your defense is going to get at, like, you're not going to have much rest like
No,
on the turnaround. So you could get worn down really quick, and if you somehow make it that far and you're in that third game, there's probably not a lot left in that tank. So if you can't get more than 2 minutes of rest on that sideline, you're not going out there with fresh legs.
definitely, definitely. Um, I think our rankings are pretty similar from here on in. I know at 9, I've got Indiana as well. Like we said, great story. Coach Sig's done an awesome job there.
Hmm.
8, I believe you had Ohio State at 8 as well, or maybe you had
Yes,
Tennessee.
I
Um,
had Ohio State at 8.
okay, yeah, so we were the same there. We talked about their performance this weekend, how that raised some eyebrows and some questions. And I think one thing, if I'm a Ohio State fan, I would be worried about, if Penn State gets trounced and just gets run out of the stadium this weekend by Oregon. I might be a little worried. That's your best win right now, beating
Hmm.
that Penn State team. So if Oregon just goes out and demolishes them, how do you make that, or how does that make you feel? Right? You hung with Oregon. That was an awesome game. Um, Maybe Dan Lanning took the penalty on purpose. Maybe he didn't. But I don't know. I don't know. This isn't, I don't think, the same offense, or at least it didn't look like the same offense that went head to head with Oregon this weekend against Michigan. So hopefully,
Hmm.
if you're an Ohio State fan, Ryan Day and Chip Kelly take this time off and figure their stuff out there.
I mean, that Ohio State, if that does happen, you could be looking at Ohio State falling even more in the rankings.
Yeah,
Having a
definitely.
loss to Oregon, their best win, getting trounced, and not ending the season on good play. So next thing you know, you could go from, oh yeah, we're going to be the number 5 seed, to, oh, we're hanging on for dear life at like the 11 or 12
Yeah,
seed,
yeah,
and they're going on the road to a historic rival Notre Dame, or going down to Georgia. Like, could be a complete flip of the script from 3 weeks earlier.
definitely, definitely. I'm kind of with you on Tennessee. I'm not 100% sold on them. They're my number 7 team right now. I think the Vols have potential to be that explosive Tennessee offense that we have come to know under Josh Heupel. But Nico has not looked awesome this year. You know, that defense is great. Dylan Sampson's great. But Nico has been super, super inconsistent, especially when he's looking at drop 8 coverage. Look at that Arkansas game. That's what they did at the end of the game to kind of get him out of that rhythm. And it worked. That's a defining win for Sam Pittman. And if they don't win that game, they're not bowling this year.
Mm-hmm.
At 6, I've got SMU. Great story, really solid ACC team. Like you said, their only loss this year is to BYU early in the season. That's before Rhett Lashley named Kevin Jennings the permanent starter. They were still doing a little bit of a starter by committee type thing in the BYU game. So I don't think they really had the rhythm that they do now. I think if those teams played again, I think SMU beats BYU. But again,
Mm-hmm.
you can't play that game of hypotheticals. But SMU is a really solid team. I expect them to take care of business this weekend against Clemson in what's kind of a pseudo home game for Clemson. At number 5, I've got the Dogs. I think Georgia's a really solid team. Yes, they have 2 losses. And yes, that might be a little controversial to rank a 2-loss SEC team above a 1-loss ACC team. But I think this Georgia team's really deep. But just like we talked about with Tennessee, just like we talked about with Ohio State, which Georgia team is going to show up, right? Is it going to be that team that pushed around Texas at Darrell Royal Stadium, or is it going to be the team that really, for most of that game on Friday night, got out physicaled by Georgia Tech?
Mm-hmm.
If you do that against Texas this weekend, you're not winning that SEC championship. And if you do that in a first round matchup, you're probably going home. So I think Georgia's an interesting team to take a look at. Then to round out my rankings, at number 4, I've got Penn State. Number 3, I've got Notre Dame. Number 2, I've got Texas. And then I think everybody in the country and everybody in their right mind has the Ducks at number 1 right now.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I mean, I unless you're doing some kind of advanced sabermetrics or whatever the ESPN FBI is calculating on, the Ducks are the number 1 team in the country. It should be a no-brainer whenever you fill out your bracket. You start with Oregon 1 and then go from there.
Yeah, definitely.
That being said, bringing up the FPI, that this is one of the worst years I've seen it. I don't know the metrics that they use on it, but the fact that it still views Southern Cal as a top 20
Yeah.
power.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
very weird. Very, very
it,
weird.
it's having an off year for sure, which I guess could go toward how crazy this season has been. It's just completely breaking the computers.
Yeah, definitely.
So, um, yeah, very very good stuff. I want to pose a question to you. What team? Which of the fringe teams? So I mean, the Ole Misses, the Alabamas, and assuming Arizona State takes care of business in the Big 12
Hmm.
championship game, what of the big 3 like SEC schools on that fringe? I mean, we can throw Miami in there.
Yeah, yeah. I think Miami's
Um,
dead, but we we can talk about them if you
you
want to.
know, who uh, who of those 3 do you want to see, or who of that group do you want to see? And then who do you think deserves it? So who do you want first?
Sure, sure. So who I want, I know this is my first time on the show, so I'll admit my bias here. I am a South Carolina grad and a South Carolina fan, so I'm gonna go with the Gamecocks with who I would want to see in there. And TJ, you want to say who you want, or do you want to jump into who I think deserves it?
I'll throw into the one, and yeah, I mean I've only done a few of these like podcast esque shows on the channel. I don't think I've said who, but as you are, I am also a South Carolina grad. Try not to put too much of that bias in there. Of course, in my rankings, it sure looks like I put it there. Um, but I did my best to kind of go about the whole picture. But I would obviously want South Carolina to be in there.
Hmm.
I think that they are realistically probably going to be that first or second team out
I agree.
when it's all said and done. But that is the team who I want in there the most. So if I see them pop in at number 11 or number 12, I'm gonna be very happy.
Yeah, I'd be ecstatic if the Gamecocks can get in. As for who I think is going to get in, you and I might differ on this one based on our rankings. I think it's going to be Alabama. The reason I think it's going to be Alabama, yes, both them and Ole Miss beat Georgia. But Alabama also blew the doors off Missouri, who, yeah, we talked about them. They're not a college football playoff team, but it's still a ranked opponent. When people thought LSU still was something, they went into Tiger Stadium at night, completely destroyed them, and their defenses look better. I won't say good, but better since those concerns at the beginning of the year, particularly the Vanderbilt game. So I think Alabama's the one who sneaks in and gets that last spot.
Yeah, I'm with you as well. I think that at Bama's highest, they are better than the other teams in this kind of grouping. Along with it being Alabama, the Oklahoma game is very much a head scratcher. Can you say it's a fluke? Not fully, because they've got other games in there as well where they haven't looked as good. That Georgia game they could easily have lost. Next thing you know, they're a four-loss team. We're not even talking about them. But that being said, their high points are very high points. Ole Miss has looked good in some games, but then also they have a Kentucky loss that's very equal to an Oklahoma loss. But I think Alabama is in reality going to be who just barely sneaks it up in there. Um, so that's kind of where I see it.
Yeah.
But I will spin cycle the question a little bit. So we both think that Alabama will be in.
Yeah.
Um, I think there is a chance that the committee does a similar situation of Florida State next year and does go with the hot team in South Carolina. Does that make that the right answer? I don't know. But I could easily see them going, okay, they're a really hot team. We're going to put the hot team in. And historically speaking, they would be the smallest program in that group going in. So it would be highly controversial, but for how they are, wouldn't be crazy. And I do believe that Pat's computer has just died. So that works out, at least on the podcast. We'll see if he comes back in a second. I'll talk for just a minute longer. But that was about to be the end of our show anyway. Looks like technology has decided that it will decide when our show is done. Um, but yeah, so it should be interesting. We'll see what happens at conference championship week. And then we'll have another show out about the same time next week. We'll also be able to react to the playoff committee's rankings. And there will be a lot to talk about there for sure. Whether every conference championship game finishes the way we expect it will, or if we get total chaos, there will be a lot to talk about. So for Pat, since his computer's dead, I'm TJ, and thanks to everybody for tuning in.